Mario! Mario!
Mario! Mario! Mario! Mario! Mario! Mario! Mario! Mario! Mario!
In 1993, everyone wanted to be Mario. In the 80s and 90s, back when you often had pretty scarce real estate to advertise your products, you had to make sure every second and every ad space counted. There were, of course, a handful of titans to take cues from, and in the video game industry, none of them stood as tall as Nintendo. Famously, they ostensibly saved the console video game industry through their careful marketing and ferocious business savvy with their flagship brands, to the point where their IPs became synonymous with the very idea of video games. This is all cultural legend at this point. It's like I almost don't even need to explain this stuff to you, but it's good to give ourselves a refresher on just what other companies were up against at the time. Sega was one such competitor. After the downturn of their initial business as an arcade machine publisher in the 60s and 70s, and the lukewarm success of their debut console in the States, they were looking for a radical change to give themselves a leg up against Mario's empire. Their newly released console, the Sega Genesis, wasn't unsuccessful in Japan and Europe, but was nowhere near Nintendo's throne like they had hoped. They had recently parted ways with their old North American distributors to instead work with Atari, and in October they had gotten a new CEO from the deal in Michael Katz, who had an idea on how to solve the company's problem. He figured that pitching the console on its own merits solely wouldn't cut it in this new era, and felt that if they wanted to become a threat to Nintendo's territory, they needed to directly come at them with full force. Their branding became more abrasive and hostile towards their main rival, and after Katz was replaced with Mattel's Tom Kalinske in early 1991, and with the release of Sonic the Hedgehog in June, this edgy Western marketing push was cranked up even further. Now, sound is incredibly important to establishing a successful brand. If I asked you what McDonald's sounds like, I wouldn't even need to finish the question before you'd have your answer. And one sound in particular, haphazardly placed into Sega's new ad campaign, would be the spark that would finally turn them into a truly household name.
Sega! Sega!
It'd be a lie to say this scream alone was what sealed Sega's fate, but it was absolutely a major factor in why these ads stuck in people's minds. That single soundbite was inadvertently the culmination of the whole in-your-face direction their branding was taking, and it'd be redundant to say that it absolutely paid off. Like I said, this story is all the stuff of legend nowadays. The 16-bit console wars is one of those landmark events in gaming's early history. But personally, however, I'm more interested in a single piece of information that's likely to get forgotten underneath the mess of marketing analysis and youthful tubularness, and it's the one question that's been eating away at me for years. So, who did that scream? You'd think that'd be common knowledge at this point, at least to people in the know, but I haven't really seen anyone talk about it. Well, I mean, okay, it isn't that much of a mystery. If you look it up, it's said that the scream is done by a guy named Jimbo Matison, who was the staff director at the production house making this new wave of Genesis commercials. So if this is readily available information, then why am I making a video about it? Well, here's the thing. Initially, I just wanted to make a quick video about the branding of the Genesis, and specifically about the origins of the sound effects associated with that ad campaign, and that, of course, meant getting all of this information corroborated. But weirdly enough, whenever I tried to find secondary sources about who did the Sega scream, just to make sure this was a confirmed thing, I never came up with anything concrete. All of the sources I could find were either Jimbo himself, or from places obviously just taking from Jimbo during an interview they did or whatever. And if you know anything about how people getting things wrong works, then you know it's risky to just take the guy's word for it. This is a pretty old and obscure piece of information, so I'm not surprised that it's barely mentioned anywhere, but regardless of whether or not Jimbo actually did the scream, just coincidentally all of the sites that I saw talking about it just happen to be places that I wouldn't trust to give me untainted information. This is more just me showcasing all the weird and funny things that I found while trying to confirm whether or not this one obscure tidbit about the Genesis is true or not. And so to start us off, let's take a quick look at the man himself, Jimbo Matison. As mentioned before, Jimbo was the staff director and copywriter at Colossal Pictures, a pretty big production company that did a lot of work on commercials, TV TV bumpers, interstitials, title graphics, and the like in the 80s and 90s. They came into the colossal picture for Sega in 1992, when the company tasked the newly hired ad agency Goodbye Berlin and Silverstein to develop and produce TV commercials for this new edgy phase for the Genesis. To my knowledge, Jimbo wasn't directly involved with the creation of the commercials, but he did work there as they were being made. The story goes that Jimbo was called in to record some screams, and then later in the editing stage, the team decided essentially on a whim to put the soundbite at the end of the commercials. Like I said before, there's not a lot of places that mention this fun fact about him before the big one that we'll get to, so I'll go over a handful that I did find to round out the timeline a bit. The earliest time I could find Jimbo himself bringing up the scream was on the back of a book he wrote in 2003 titled So Crazy Japanese Toys. Seen here in just the worst scan of a book I've ever seen on Google Books. Like, look at this man, come on. Then in 2006, we get this article from Star Bulletin, promoting a TV show Jimbo was a part of, where they mention him doing the scream in their brief little bio for him. Apparently, he co-wrote and co-starred in a show about comedically dubbing foreign films with Trevor Moore of Whitest Kids You Know fame. Not really relevant to my investigation, but it is weird to see these two cross paths for some reason. And finally, the law of video essays tells me there should be a third example here, but there isn't one, so, Now, before we move on to the real meat of this story, I just want to bring up the obvious conclusion you could come to why this is all the case. That Jimbo is trying to Tallarico us. You know, to embellish or make up a story to seem more involved in a cultural moment than you truly were. Like, out of all of his accomplishments at his tenure at Colossal Pictures, this is the only one he seems to single out to this day. He's clearly very proud of it, which makes it a bit suspicious when he seems to be the only source for this claim. But to nip this in the bud as soon as possible, no, I don't have any doubt that Jimbo Matison is the one who actually did the Sega Scream. From what I can tell, he isn't really desperate for attention or acclaim. His story hasn't changed in all the years he's told it, and despite how proud of it he is, he hasn't really tried to capitalize on being the Sega Scream guy. I can totally buy that this is just something Jimbo's proud to say that he did, but is a detail that falls through the cracks when telling the full story. This video is less about exposing a fraud and more about the struggles to corroborate old and obscure details of bigger stories like this. So if we want to get closer to that, then let's broaden our scope a bit to look at the scant indirect sources that bring up this story. Surely one of them can put my mind at ease about this. The main source I found for the marketing of the Genesis, i.e. the one I pulled a lot from for the intro to this video, and the place I initially saw this bit about who did the Scream, was this 2006 article on Sega16.com. It's a really well-made piece with a lot of good information, and there it is bringing up Jimbo's name as the guy who did the thing, albeit in a sort of tacked-on sounding way. And one thing I definitely appreciate is that all of the article's sources are listed at the bottom of the page, so if any place was going to give me good outside confirmation of this, it would be somewhere in this list. But unfortunately, I've tracked down and checked all but one of these sources, and not a single one of them mentioned Jimbo Matison, or even bring up the idea that the Scream was recorded by a guy with a name. The only reason I couldn't check all of them was because this second one here is literally a chapter from a 2004 marketing textbook that I'd have to pay to get physically in order to read. Maybe the smoking gun anecdote I needed was in there the whole time, but in all likelihood it's not. And buying a 2-decade-old textbook to read a single article and never touch again is a bridge too far for me personally. And also, this is a smaller detail about this list, but one of these sources is an interview Sega 16 did with Sega's then director of marketing, Al Nielsen, but it was released 2 years after this article came out and was presumably retroactively added to the source list. That interview doesn't mention Jimbo at all, but I tried to find an archive of the main article before it was a source, but it was cut into smaller pages back in 2006, and the page where the Jimbo mention would have been hasn't been archived, unfortunately. So with all that in mind, it's kind of weird that an article as well researched and organized as this one can just throw in a detail seemingly unsourced like that. I'm sure the tidbit that Jimbo was the one who did the Scream was put in here for a good reason, but it's all just so unnecessarily vague and sketchy for, as far as I can tell, no reason. Jimbo's name has been brought up in one other page on Sega 16, in their interview with former Goodbye Berlin and Silverstein advertising specialist David O'Hare in 2020. In the article, O'Hare is telling the story of how the Scream wound up in the commercials, and the interviewee brings up that it's been said Jimbo Matison was the one who did the Scream. And so in response, O'Hare goes, "Oh, that's interesting." Who? So that's yet another example of this information being frustratingly obscure, that even the people involved in the story don't know this guy's name. So if a site as good as Sega 16 is leading us to dead ends, then let's keep looking to see where else this detail gets brought up, and if any of these stories can be trusted. The other big Sega lore repository site, Sega Retro, also brings up Jimbo's name, but the only source for anything on the page is Jimbo's own website, so I'd argue that shouldn't count. So instead, let's look outside of the web and take a look at probably the most famous source that talks about this story, and that is the 2014 book Console Wars by Blake J. Harris. Yes, I bought a decade-old book just to read one chapter and never touch again. Shut up. It's a dramatized retelling of the infamous internal business and marketing war between Sega and Nintendo in the mid-90s, with information compiled with several interviews Harris did with the people directly involved with the story. And this book is no doubt a big factor in why the story of the 16-bit console war is so infamous in modern pop culture. I remember Console Wars being the book about video games back when it came out, but despite being into retro games as a kid, I never felt like reading it until right now for this video, and let me tell you, it's kinda rough. First off, I didn't know in buying this that the paperback version is actually a 2015 reprint back when they were trying to turn this into a movie that apparently never materialized. And that of course means we get a 19-page foreword by the film's then executive producers, actors Seth Rogen and frequent Seth Rogen film director Evan Goldberg, and it is just as laugh-out-loud hilarious as you can imagine. And getting to the actual book part of this book, things don't get much better. A big issue that a lot of critics have already brought up is that the dialogue in here is noticeably unrealistic. A lot of the time it sounds like I'm reading an ABC sitcom of the story instead of what actually happened. And there is a decent explanation for this. You see, a lot of this dialogue, and a decent chunk of the smaller details of this narrative, are just Blake J. Harris's best guess at what went down. The book admits during the beginning that a lot of these scenes are either embellished or wholly constructed based on what Harris could glean from his interviews and research, which, as you could imagine, makes it a dubious source for telling us anything besides the broader strokes of what went down. And not for nothing, I've seen people online more invested in Sega than I am say that the book is decently inaccurate when it comes to a beat-by-beat retelling of the story. But getting back on track, the book does tell the story of how the Scream came to be from Jimbo's point of view, starting on page 295. According to the book, Jimbo was sick and vomiting at his home one day when he got a call from a producer at Colossal Pictures who wanted to bring him in for a quick voiceover bit. After getting bribed with free lunch, he made his way to the recording booth, where he was told all he had to do was scream the word Sega, the name of a company he up until that point had never heard of. He would do a whole hour of as many takes as possible screaming the name, and afterwards he asked how they planned on using the audio they had just recorded, to which the ad agency head in the room replied, In response, Jimbo told them about some commercials he remembered where they said the name of the brand at the end of the ad to keep the title as the last thing the viewer remembers, and nonchalantly suggests maybe doing something like that before leaving, apparently completely forgetting the free lunch that was promised to him. You know, after reading that, I could see how in a vacuum that's a pretty believable version of events. I don't doubt the process was actually that impromptu and seemingly innocuous in the moment, but the thing that kind of gives me pause is that from the way this is written, you can really tell that Harris's only source is just whatever Jimbo told him during his interview. That of course isn't inherently bad, but it does muddy the water in terms of what really happened versus what Harris invented to make the story better versus what Jimbo just happened to get wrong. Like that bit towards the end of Jimbo slipping in the suggestion of putting the sound at the end of the commercial. He might have said something similar to that, but from what I've been able to glean, that doesn't really line up with other accounts of how the scream actually got in there. Like, according to the David O'Hare interview from earlier, the soundbite was actually just screamed into a hot mic by some random person in the studio that he doesn't remember. And the decision to put it at the end of the commercial was actually just spur of the moment at the editing stage while developing their initial pitch video to Sega. So either Matison or O'Hare both have their wires crossed about this situation, or Harris made this up as a fake biopic-esque aha moment, or Matison made this up to make himself seem more involved than he was. And from what little information I have, I can't tell which of these is true. But you wanna know something funny? There's a single detail in this book that fully broke my trust in this being a wholly reliable source before I even decided to give it any scrutiny. And you wanna know what that is? On page 336, when telling a story of how far and wide the Scream had spread, they spelled Jimbo Matison's name wrong. Like, see right here. They call him Jimbo Matison. for no reason. Like, you interviewed the guy and you got his name right like 100 pages earlier. What happened? If you're telling me that the retro gaming history book could let a mistake like that slide, then imagine what other more important incorrect things are put in here when they were altering, reconstructing, or imagining this story. Man, I really want some retro gamer freak out there to go in-depth on all that this book gets wrong. I wanted to, really. It seems fun, but it is very outside of the scope of today's video. So for now, this book appears to just be yet another dead end to throw onto the pile of doubtable sources for this claim. And it was about this point in my research where I had run out of leads and finally had to resign myself to the fact that unfortunately there's a limit to how far you can zoom into a narrative before the details stop being objectively confirmable. The Sega Genesis came out over 30 years ago, and most of the people who did the work to make it a success are well past their 50s or 60s by now. So for smaller parts of that massive interconnected story of how the Genesis came to be, unless there's some contemporaneous smoking gun or well-archived documentation, the only thing we have to rely on in the modern day to get these details are the 3-decade-away recollections of people who had more important things to remember about that time. The true origins of the Sega Scream are at the event horizon of historical documentation, where begrudgingly the only primary and secondary sources we have are all stemming from a single guy who would have all to gain from being the center of a small piece of the puzzle. But like I said, this video isn't meant to be a call-out of a hack who lied his way to the top, because from what I found, that just isn't the case. The thing that I've learned from looking into this way too deep is that, much like how history is written by the victors, history is also often written by the notable. I would love for Jimbo to get his hopefully earned flowers for his small yet impactful contribution to where gaming is today, but that's gonna be an uphill battle when all the places that mention his name are either just getting it from Jimbo himself, or similarly at the edge of what even can be confirmed. Or sometimes they fail step 1 and don't even get the name right. Funnily enough, I was doing a cursory search to see if anyone else had caught the name blunder in Console Wars online, and I ended up finding an interview with Harris where they also call him Jimbo Matison. Ironically enough, this happened while they were bringing up how small his footprint was despite his significance to the narrative. On one hand, it is funny to see that someone out there didn't check anything and fell for this mistake. I thought you were a platform of integrity, arcadesushi.com. But on the other hand, this is just one more example of how figures like Jimbo's names keep getting forgotten, in this case literally, and how in the absence of us remembering these stories, it'll be up to the sloppy work of people like Blake J. Harris to get the information wrong and just make finding what really happened even muddier. I'll fully admit that I came into the story not believing Jimbo when he said he did it, because he was the only one saying he did it. But that feeling over time has moved on from that, and more so towards the idea that Jimbo is a victim of unfortunate circumstance. And the reason that he's so proud to say he did the Scream is because he's one of the only people who can say he did it. You often hear stories like this and expect some opportunistic liar crushing the people who deserve the credit because we've seen it so many times, and frankly it's a more interesting narrative. But this, like many other details, is an example of the credit being forgotten simply because no one thought to remember it, which is arguably better but is still a disappointing reality if you're a fan of documenting obscurity. There comes a point when you're fractaling down the research pipeline where you're forced to throw your hands up and just take someone's word for it. Cause although it's not the most airtight source you could find, there are certain times where if you don't take their word, there's a chance that no one else will. You know, the funny thing is, I'm not really that much of a Sega guy. There's nothing on screen that could indicate this, but growing up I was always more of a Nintendo kid. The reason I started looking into the people behind the sounds of the Genesis was because I figured it was a part of the story that I, and presumably a lot of other people, didn't think to compile information for, and boy was I right. The initial idea for this video was also going to be me looking into the famous Sega choir jingle, but I found even less information about that. I couldn't even find who originally sung it. Oh well, someone smarter than me who is more invested in Sega can look for all that stuff. I'll stick to single-handedly saving investigative journalism from the comfort of my mother's basement, thank you very much. But with all that being said, that was my manic episode into the origins of the Sega Scream. And if you want to do what Nintendo don't, then maybe like this video. And if you want to give power to the player, that's me, then consider subscribing as well. And I'll see you all in the next video.